Good morning, I'm Steve Koonin, and I'm the moderator for this session, DARPA Postcards from the Future. For the next 50 minutes, we're going to pull back the curtain a bit on DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, occasionally known during its history as ARPA, but currently back to the original DARPA. DARPA is a somewhat mythical and mysterious agency within the Department of Defense. It has been for the last 60 years charged with inventing the military's technical future. And it has done so with great impact, both in national security and in the broader civilian context. This is the agency that really did invent the internet. To guide us in this exploration, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Arati Prabhakar, who has been the agency's 20th director for the past 4 years. Arati started her career with a PhD in applied physics from Caltech. She did stints in the Office of Technology Assessment and as a DARPA program manager. At age 34, she became the director of the National Institutes of Science and Technology for 4 years. She was the first woman to do that. She then did stints in the private sector and as a venture capitalist. And as I mentioned, she's been doing the DARPA job for the past 4 years. So the batting order is that Arati will make some remarks for about 20 minutes. She and I will then have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to broader Q&A from the audience. Dr. Prabhakar.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks so much to Ben and to Donna for the chance to do this with you all. When Ben asked if I would do this, I said yes with enthusiasm because I hoped it would be a place where we could talk about the exhilarating new possibilities of technology, but also the mind-boggling conundrums that come with them. And certainly that has been what's been going on in all the sessions I've been in the last couple of days. So I'm looking forward to talking more with all of you about that. I would actually love to know if anyone in the audience has worked with DARPA before. We have any folks here who've done anything with DARPA? Who's heard about DARPA a little bit before? Okay, great. So, I want to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from in the work that we're doing today. And to do that, I think you really have to understand that DARPA's story starts in 1957, because that's the year that this happened. And I talked to a lot of audiences who don't know what Sputnik was. I suspect some of you actually were here when Sputnik actually occurred. So you know that it was a tremendous shock in the United States. There was celebration because it was the first time humans had ever put a satellite on orbit. On the other hand, the humans who did it were the Soviets, and it was the height of the Cold War, certainly got our attention. And of course, the United States took a whole series of very important steps triggered by this very upsetting event. One of those was to create a new agency in the Defense Department, DARPA, with the explicit mission to prevent that kind of technological surprise. And our early leaders at DARPA, many, many decades ago, they very quickly realized that the best way to prevent surprise is to go create a few surprises of our own, and that's what this agency has been doing for nearly 6 decades. So for example, we demonstrated stealth technology that made it possible to fly an aircraft that looked like this in reality, but to an adversary's radar looked about as big as that. We demonstrated the sensors and the networks and the precision-guided weapons that made it possible for our military to strike targets with this kind of precision. And when I talk with our senior military leaders and military service members serving around the world, when I talk to senior people in the Pentagon, these advanced military capabilities are why they know DARPA, because we helped fundamentally change how we fight today. As Steve told you, I also had the privilege of spending about half of my professional life in the commercial tech community, a particular slice of it in Silicon Valley. And what I found in that time is that that community knew DARPA really well, but they knew us not for these military capabilities. Rather, they thought of us as the place that sparked a whole series of core technologies that also have had an impact on the world. They knew us as the place that sparked wave after wave of artificial intelligence technologies, the place that laid the foundation for many advanced integrated circuit technologies. If you think about your smartphone, the chip in that phone that talks to the cell tower is based on technology that traces back to our early investments. When you turn your smartphone, the inertial sensor that knows that it's rotated, that technology traces back to some early work that DARPA did as well. And of course, and most iconically, most people who know about DARPA know us because of some work that began actually all the way back in the late 60s when we had this crazy idea that if you started hooking computers together initially into the ARPANET, that you might start being able to do some amazing new things. And all of us are still part of the story of how that particular adventure is turning out. So, that's a history that all of us who have the privilege of serving at DARPA today, we're super proud of that history. It tells us a couple of things. One, and critically important, is number one, DARPA did none of these big things by ourselves. Actually, DARPA is only about 200 government employees. We're in an office building in Arlington, Virginia. We don't have labs. We are a projects agency. And the only reason that we are able to achieve these kinds of off-scale impacts and to pursue our big ambitions is the fact that we are able to work with the most astounding talents you can imagine across universities, from companies, defense companies, commercial companies, large, small, all types of companies, from government labs and not-for-profit labs. Wherever there are smart, capable, technical people and labs and infrastructure, we're able on a projects basis to tap into that. And all of that is about what happens during our projects. What happens after our projects is equally important. I've shown you a number of technologies that we're now experiencing in our consumer and our commercial lives that are changing the business world. That happened because after DARPA's early technical work, vast additional resources, R&D, public R&D, private R&D flooded in. And then, of course, most critically, entrepreneurs and people in companies, investors, all poured their hearts and souls into building new products, new lines of business, new companies, and ultimately whole new industries. And of course, those were all the things that had to happen for these technologies to change not just how we fight, but how we live and work as well. So that's something that's very much on our minds as we think about the work that we're doing at DARPA today. At any moment in time, DARPA is a couple of hundred programs that are underway. Much of what we're doing today is about fundamentally rethinking complex military systems. But for today's talk, I thought I would focus with you on some things that are happening in the next generation of core technologies. And I want to share with you two major areas where we're feeling the rumblings, the beginnings of two massive tectonic shifts. And in each of these areas, I just want to give you a few glimpses of the kinds of things that we're starting to see. The first of these is a tectonic shift that builds directly on top of this information revolution that we're all experiencing and partaking in. Several people in previous sessions have talked about the flood of data that we're living in, the huge numbers of exabytes of data that are being created all the time. And in fact, if you think about the online environment, in my world, if I think about the vast flood of data from sensors that the military has, or all the sources of intelligence that we're able to tap into, we are living in a vast primordial soup of ones and zeros. And a huge revolution is underway as we start converting that data into information. Let me start with a vexing problem. This story starts a few years ago when one of my program managers went to a meeting where he learned that in the world of human trafficking, it's possible to buy a woman for $90. And he came back from that meeting and he was heartbroken, he was infuriated, and he set out to figure out if there was something that he could do that could make an impact on this problem that was just making him crazy. When he started digging into how law enforcement and the intelligence community try to track down traffickers, whether it's for arms, illegal arms, or drugs, or for human trafficking, he found that they were limited to the sort of same search tools we use. But in fact, because of that, what that meant was that they were really only able to easily search the part of the vast online community that's indexed by commercial search engines. And it feels like a lot when you're searching around on Google, but in fact it's only maybe about 5% of all the online community. The rest of that community, the deep web and the dark web, is actually a perfect place to hide the kind of commercial transactions that traffickers are interested in. So in this program, in our MEMEX program, we set out to build a set of tools that would look in the different domains in the deep web and the dark web and knit together the websites that might have similar photos or addresses or phone numbers or typos and do that kind of analysis very, very rapidly and generate, for example, maps like this that show where the flows of human trafficking are. I'm thrilled to tell you that many DA's offices across the United States today are starting to use these tools. Cyrus Vance was here from New York. And I believe they were the first DA's office to actually get a conviction that was based on using these tools. And so just one example of bringing some of these methodologies to some of the problems that are critical for the security world. So this is incredibly valuable work being done in big data, whether it's for marketing or for national security problems. Most of the work that's going on today is about finding patterns, finding correlations. The deeper work about reasoning, about causality, is left to us human beings. And despite the enormous amount of progress we've made across one research field after another, we are still confounded by the kinds of problems, these devilishly complex problems, where so many different factors are intertwined and linked and influencing each other in almost circular ways. That has been a theme of many of the conversations that we had today. This diagram looks a little bit like the previous session about what was going on in the Middle East. In the world of science, think about the tens of thousands of metabolic processes that's going on inside of every one of our cells, or think about the number of interlinked factors in climate change or in determining the food supply situation for a particular region. So we have enormous scientific resources, each of which are identifying a component of that picture. This particular program at DARPA, called Big Mechanism, aims to really start tackling this question of giving humans a way to start seeing whole system causal relationships. And it does that by, first of all, automatically ingesting and reading and forming clear information out of vast numbers of research papers. This particular example is something where the Gates Foundation used some of the tools out of our program. They fed it about 1,000 papers relating to obesity, and very quickly were able to generate this web of influences where you see factors that exacerbate a condition or that inhibit a condition. Now, this is just the first step, but I think you can see how this kind of whole system causal modeling and the assistance of a computer that helps you start seeing the whole elephant from all the places that blind men are touching the components, this is going to end up, I think, being a very revolutionary tool to help in the advancement of scientific research. Now, of course, the most complex thing any of us ever try to understand is human behavior and societal behavior. And this, too, is an area where we think these new tools and advances are going to give us phenomenal new opportunities. We recently brought in our first program manager at DARPA, whose PhD is in anthropology, and he has put together a program called Next Generation Social Science. It's just beginning, but in this particular case, we aspire to build some tools and techniques using online data, but also online communities that can represent a far vaster and more diverse sample set to try to build some experiments and start to get answers to some critically important social science questions. The one we're going to start with is the question about the factors that drive or inhibit the formation of a collective identity. It's hard to think of something that matters more for national security than understanding that. So that is the nature of this first big tectonic shift. It's really about changing our understanding, going from data to information to knowledge to real understanding. And I think that the potential here is really quite vast. The second tectonic shift that I want to touch on is about this next revolution that's happening as biology starts to become a much more tractable technology. There's an explosion of activity that's happening today as the biological sciences and medical research are colliding with what's happening in physical science and engineering with information technology. And in that bubbling cauldron, we see phenomenal opportunities for surprises of all different sorts. Some we're going to like, some we're not going to like. And I think what to me is so intriguing about this particular technological revolution is that for generations, for eons, we've thought about technologies that changed our tools, but this is about technologies that change us. And I think for many of us, this feels uncomfortable, maybe even freakish, possibly even repugnant. What I want to do is to show you a couple of examples of the kinds of advances and capabilities that I think are going to be drawing us forward into this future. And it's a good time to start asking the deeper questions about what the implications are going to be and how we want to use these technologies. Now, of course, engineering ourselves, you could argue that we do some of that already. For example, when we use vaccines to deal with infectious disease. This is where we are today. This particular period of time is H1N1. I remember that. My whole family got H1N1. I'm sure all of you remember that from a few years ago. Here's what the vaccine development process looked like for H1N1. We went as hard and fast as we know how. Shortly after the disease had started burning itself out, we were finally able to deliver the first protections through vaccines. And so we're really not able to keep up with this kind of fast-moving pandemic. That's a problem because not only are mosquitoes moving north with climate change, not only do we have mega agriculture that is piling more and more animals together so that infection jumps species as we're trying to feed more and more people around the world. Think about the fact that 8 million people get on an airplane every day, and when they get to the other side, they hug or handshake somebody and bring along whatever they brought from wherever they came from. And all of that is going on today. What lies ahead potentially could also include what happens when people start being able to harness, for example, synthetic biology, gene editing. So we haven't even gotten to the part where people are trying to make this bad, right? So we're going to have to find some very different ways to deal with infectious disease and to fundamentally change the way we think about pandemics. So a few years ago, we asked ourselves the question at DARPA, how would we nip infectious disease in the bud? This is not about can we make vaccines a little bit faster. That's a really good thing to do. We wanted to ask the radical question, can we move the response all the way to the other side of that curve? And what we are on the path to try to do today is something that's going to require changes in many different dimensions of thinking about creating protection in the community. But a core part of the thinking is to use some of the tools and the advances that have been made in gene sequencing and synthesis and gene editing and start putting them to work to collapse the amount of time that it takes to discover and then build gene codes for the antibodies and the antigens that can provide protection. We now have techniques that can collapse the amount of time that it takes to do that. Building gene codes is a lot faster than building these big biomolecules directly. And if we can deliver those gene codes to the human body, where our own cells boot up those codes and produce those big biomolecules, that is a path that we think could lead to this kind of revolution in infectious disease. This diagram is still an aspiration. Where we are today is in one of our projects. We've just that company has just come through phase 1 clinical trials for an Ebola vaccine that's based on a gene code. So that's showing that it's safe. They've also in that test shown that they are actually able to induce an immune response. We're also working on chikungunya, and very timely, if you read the paper today about what's happening in Florida, Zika. So we're at the beginning of a process, but I think it could result in this fundamental change in how we nip infectious disease in the bud. Let me finish with a last example that's about the frontiers of what's happening in neurotechnology. In the fullness of time, I think we're going to see that this genuinely allows us to move what our brains are doing beyond the limitations of the physical structure that we're living in. What I want to show you today is a glimpse of some very early work because we're at the very early stages of this. And let me start by introducing you to Doug. Doug is an individual who lost his forearms in a terrible industrial accident about 20 years ago. He is a volunteer working with the researchers at the University of Utah, where we're doing this work. And if you look on the picture on the right, you'll see that Doug, under that yellow wrap, has had a couple of chips implanted in his residual limb. And those chips are in contact with the nerve bundles that carry sensory information up to his brain. And in this next picture, what I'm going to do is show you a video, but let me explain what you're going to see in the video. This is not a product. This is very much raw lab research. So you're looking at a screen that Doug is looking at. And what he sees is a virtual hand and a virtual door. Doug's going to try to move that hand. He's going to effectively move his arm and cause that hand, the virtual hand, to move. When the virtual hand touches the virtual door, Doug's chip will receive a signal that will send a sensory input up to his brain. And watch with me as Doug experiences the sensation of moving and then closing the loop by receiving sensory feedback for the first time in 20 years.
Oh my God, I just felt that door. Oh yeah.
Can you feel the finger sliding when you do that?
Yeah, actually I can. I can get it on there. God, that is so cool.
I get excited for Doug every time I see that. This work began because one of my program managers returned from theater where he was serving as an Army doctor, convinced that we had to come up with better prosthetics for our wounded warriors. He worked on this kind of sensory activity. He also did a lot of work on motor control. For example, a woman named Jan who has had direct chip implants on her motor cortex from which she directly can think and control a prosthetic arm. And I want to walk through with you some of the possibilities that this opens. Jan can control that prosthetic arm, but that also means that she can directly control other things. For example, she went in a flight simulator and she got to fly an F-35 in a flight simulator. And motor control and sensory control is only part of what we're working on. We have other projects that are trying to repair the kind of memory loss that's often part of traumatic brain injury. And as we do that work, we think we might be able to open the door to enhancements in memory or ways to understand and accelerate the learning process. We have other projects that are trying to understand and fix the misfirings that happen across different regions of the brain and that are tied to neuropsychiatric disease. So if we're successful there, we might open the door, not just to solving those kinds of problems, but maybe even open the door to a future where you could have customized mental health states. We're doing work on the peripheral nervous system and how it monitors and helps maintain the health of all the organs in our bodies. If we're successful there, we can imagine a future where you might be able to regulate your physiological functions. So instead of medication, maybe you turn a knob to regulate your blood pressure. Each of these things I'm describing to you is still very much research. This is not product, so this is not today's reality. But we can start to think about what kinds of futures might be possible. And I'm going to do some Q&A with Steve and with you. Please ask me questions, but I want to end by asking you some questions that I think we need to start thinking about. So if in the future we have the possibility for soldiers to have neural enhancements that would allow them to focus under fire by turning their heart rate down, or to directly sense an odorless threat, or directly control a bevy of military systems to keep the adversary at bay, do we think that in that future the military will ban neural enhancements the way we ban performance-enhancing steroids today? Or conversely, is there a future where neural enhancement becomes a condition of military service? And that's just the warfighter. These kinds of technologies over time could open the door to all kinds of possibilities for all the rest of us as well. A future where we could stop dropping the water bottle. We could overcome depression. A future where we can boost our physical health. Imagine a future where we can learn very complex tasks or languages in a flash. a future where we might be able to connect with each other in completely and radically new ways. So in that future, are we going to think about neural enhancement, the way we think about braces or laser eye surgery? It's, something that it's just a personal choice. If we go down that path, are we going to create a future of neural haves and have-nots? Is there even possibly a future where we come to view neural enhancement as something that's not just a privilege, but needs to be a right? Every one of the technologies that we've been talking about throughout this meeting and that I've talked about with you today, I think is going to pose these kinds of mind-boggling conundrums. And the reason I think it's very important to talk with you about it is we wrestle with these kinds of questions in the research that we do at DARPA, but the answers to these questions really are going to need all of us engaged together. So I very much look forward to the opportunity to talk with you and answer your questions and sit down with Steve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Arati. I think that was a wonderful sampler of the ways in which DARPA's work will certainly impact the broader society. And thank you for that. I'm sure it will stimulate many questions. But I want to take our conversation, at least initially, in a somewhat different direction.
Okay.
It's about the D in DARPA.
Yeah.
And the national security implications of what you all are doing, which is ultimately the underlying rationale for it. I guess I'd like to start off by asking you to talk a little bit about the importance of advanced technology in national security, in particular in the Department of Defense, and maybe frame it in the context of the first, second, third offset discussion. That might be interesting for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. For a very long time, a core tenet in our approach to national security, especially in this country, has been that technology is going to be a differentiator and a lever that we have that we can use to offset often very substantial numerical advantages on the other side. So, for example, in the post-World War II era, we were in an extended period during which Soviet forces were far more substantial than ours. We and our allies really didn't have many choices other than tactical nuclear weapons to try to offset that numerical superiority. And it's, by the way, it's, in a meeting like this, it's easy to think about how bad things are today, but I have to tell you, I think it's a better world when tactical nuclear weapons are not our only choice anymore. So the reason tactical nuclear weapons are not our only choice anymore is largely because of Bill Perry and many others in his time who drove the advances in technology, especially precision strike, precision-guided munitions, the stealth aircraft, and all the other things that have to be part of delivering that capability. But essentially this idea that by being able to very precisely hit targets, especially deep targets on the other side, that was a way that we could dramatically offset numerical superiority and not have to rely on tactical nukes. That was, I think, a recent and stellar example of technology to offset numerical superiority. The question we're asking in the Defense Department today, as we come out of a period of 2 ground wars and a focus on counterterrorism and realize what's happening in terms of military capability in China, in Russia, Iran, North Korea, the question today is, as those countries with their military capabilities have learned how to handle the advances in precision strike and in stealth technology, now what do we do? What's the next technology revolution? And that is the core focus of much of the work we're doing on military systems at DARPA. Maybe just to give you one quick example, I think the story really for the next offset is going to be about breaking this very powerful model that we have had to use monolithic systems to solve these big, hard problems. Just a simple example, when we want to, we put up these enormous satellites today. Think about putting a school bus together and then launching it up to geosynchronous orbit. It's 1/10 of the way to the moon. So it costs billions of dollars, takes a decade. Once it gets there, if it doesn't work, you start all over. And even if it does work and it's providing all this marvelous intelligence, it's not that hard in a time of war for an adversary to take it down. So now, in a future where we have small satellites, the ability to put launches, to do a launch tomorrow, that's one of the things we're working on at DARPA, And now you can start to imagine radically different space architectures that are much more nimble, distributed, and much more survivable when a bad day really comes.
Of course, the problem of maintaining technology advantage is very different now than it was, let us say, 30 or 40 years ago. We've got the growth of the private sector in a global world in which there's a free flow of ideas and people. COTS, the commercial off-the-shelf technologies, start to become very capable and would allow an adversary to create many of these capabilities themselves. How does DARPA think about both leveraging that global enterprise, but also staying ahead of the competition?
Yeah, that is precisely the technology landscape. We think about that a lot. And I think in DoD, there's a great sense of foreboding about commercial technology because it enables everyone around the world. I actually don't, I think that's just a fact of life, and I think there are enormous opportunities to still create a significant national advantage. And the core concept over and over again in our portfolio, what I see is, number one, our Defense Department has to be able to access leading edge commercial technology. Now that sounds simple, and of course the US is in a very good position, but just something seemingly as simple as advanced semiconductor technologies, that's not that easy to access just inside the United States anymore. So number one, we have to have trusted access to the best technologies wherever they are in the world. And then number two, if we're going to have something differentiated, it's really going to be about deeply integrating advanced components from around the world with DoD secret sauce. So just one example, we have the world's best radar and communication systems and electronic warfare systems. The way we do that is, number one, we get access to the best component technologies from around the world, and then number two, we combine it with some very specialized, not silicon, some advanced materials, radio chips and radio arrays that allow us to have full systems that give us a tremendous advantage, even though we're building on top of a commercial technology base.
In many defense-related but not defense-unique technologies, you see the private sector moving ahead, in my experience, more rapidly than the government. Particularly, there are many small companies now putting up small sats to do persistent imagery. They do it much better, but for the government regulation about the resolution that they can provide. And you see the data aggregators, Google, Axiom, and so on, doing deep mining of societal data, again, in my experience, a lot more proficiently than the government can do it with its own internal resources. I expect that's another challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, those are two great examples of capabilities that you just want to use as aggressively as you can. And then the minute you start looking at the kinds of problems we need for military capability or intelligence, over and over again, what you'll see is problems that require using and then building on top of that. Just a simple example, if we are to understand how ISIS is pushing influence through social media, ISIS or Russia for that matter. You know, if I'm a brand manager for Crest at Procter & Gamble, I can figure out how my brand is doing through sentiment analysis and social media, but I also have the entire back end through Google or Facebook that ties what's happening to the very specific demographics of the people that are logging in and doing searches and using Facebook. I don't have that in the national security world. And so now trying to answer the same questions about how sentiment is moving through social media when all we can see is only that which is completely public, that's a very different, much harder challenge. So absolutely we get commercial tools to do that, and then we add secret sauce on top of that.
So let's talk a little bit about how DARPA does a piece of its business, and that is the following. You clearly need people who will stay at the forefront of technology, if not look beyond the forefront. Civil service in the government being what it is, it's not the most attractive employer for people who can easily find more lucrative employment in the private sector. How do you go about attracting and keeping such people?
So the DARPA models, again, back to the very earliest years, is first of all to bring people in for short tours of duty. And I think this is directly tied to our mission. Our mission is not to build deep institutional capacity in any particular area. We need that, and there are lots of other parts in government and private sector where we do that. DARPA's job is different. Our job is to find sort of slightly, like half crazy people who are very deep technically, but are able to think out about where technology could go and what kind of a difference it really makes to national security. And what we do is we bring those people in. They come, sometimes they're university professors who come on a leave, or they might have had backgrounds in commercial industry or the defense industry, or they could come from other parts of government. We bring them in for typically 3 to 5 years, and they are half of my 200 government employees. Their job is to run as hard and fast as they can in those 3 to 5 years and build and execute these programs that could really show the world something that is dramatically more advanced than what's possible today, really change what's possible. And by the way, people know about my program managers, and they are the rock stars that everyone sees. You might ask what the other 100 people do. The other 100 people make sure that place just hums so that these guys can get something done in 3 to 5 years. And you really need that whole mechanism working smoothly, as I think it is. Everyone is completely mission driven. We do not have the ability to compete directly on salary. We recently were trying to hire a really interesting young candidate. First, I thought I was competing against a tenure track position at a really good university, but he turned that down, so that was good. And then I found out we were competing against Apple, and we can't even start our salaries with the same digit at the front as Apple can. We did get this fellow, and I'm really excited that we did. And the reason he or anyone else comes is it is a chance for the right person at the right time. It is the best place on the planet to stand to move your technology field forward. And getting to do that and to serve your country at the same time is something that is, fortunately for me, it is irresistible to about 100 people at a time.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So several other agencies in the federal government have tried to emulate the DARPA model. IARPA for the intelligence community, ARPA-E
which you
in the
were
Department
involved
of Energy.
with,
I
right?
helped set up when I was in the government. HS-ARPA, the Homeland Security version of it. And I think they've had mixed success, in my opinion. I wonder if you could reflect on how they've been successful or not, and some of the factors that have made DARPA the prototype for doing this kind of organization.
Well, for context, I should say that DARPA's $3 billion budget is only about 2% of federal investment in R&D. And I don't think all of it should be like DARPA, because we have lots of other things that we're trying to do, but a little bit more than 2% that is spent with this model, I think would be enormously impactful. And I've been a huge fan of all of those attempts to try to get something going. I think ARPA-E and IARPA are both, they're both very young, but both of them have really thought through what works from DARPA, and then how do you adapt it to their particular environment, be it energy or intelligence. And I'm really excited by the early progress that I see. They have that DARPA spirit. They know that you can take risk and it's okay to fail because you're trying to reach for this enormous impact. And critically, you asked about success factors. The only reason DARPA has succeeded for all these years, and that we continue to have a chance to put more points on the board, is because every one of my bosses, Assistant Secretary, Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary, Secretary of Defense, and President, both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill, everyone understands why this has to get done, and they give us room to do it, and they give us the autonomy to try things, to fail, pick up, and just keep going until we knock one out of the ballpark. And I think that, I'm very, very hopeful that these fledgling ARPA organizations will continue to get the support and the room.
I saw the way ARPA-E shook up the DOE mainline programs in energy technologies, and it was refreshing
That's great.
To see that happen. We have just about 1 minute before we turn it over to questions. Maybe some reflections on government service. I suspect most people in the audience have not been in the federal government before. You've done it twice. I've had the privilege once.
Yeah.
What are some of your reactions, both in your current stint and in your prior stints, to being part of that enormous organization?
We share the fact that you left a world that you knew deeply and well and jumped into a different one. I think there's a real personal reward for doing that. I was lucky enough to stumble into public service very early in my career. I left Caltech with a PhD in 1984, loved technology, did not want to do laboratory research. No one knew what to do with me at Caltech, but I had a great thesis advisor who said, go try something, and I sort of stumbled into an opportunity to be a DARPA program manager at the age of 27, which was a little insane, but changed my life. I spent, I don't know, about 13 years in the government, very much loved the opportunity to do what I did and to serve the public through that. I very much wanted to see what technology looked like, not when you were pushing it, but when you were pulling it and turning it into products and businesses, and had the opportunity to do that for 15 years in Silicon Valley. You know, I loved every minute of my time in Silicon Valley, and I felt so privileged to get to do what I got to do there. But there really has never been anything for me that has been as satisfying as public service, because I've had the great fortune of working in places in government where you could make a difference. And when you make that difference, you know you're doing it for something that really matters. And you know, I think I hope everyone here would have some opportunity, and there's so many ways, but I think it's one of the most personally satisfying things you can do.
I wonder if you had the same experience. For me, one of the great surprises and satisfactions was the quality of the senior civil servants, both in their talent and their dedication to the mission. I found that very uplifting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am pained by the caricature of public service that certainly pervaded my Silicon Valley community that I was. People would look at me like, you seem like such a reasonable person. How is it that you spent all that time in government? And similarly in Washington, I think it seems a little mysterious and a little mercenary out in the private sector. And I think just we've got to be communicating with each other.
Much better communication across those lines.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Critically important.
Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. A little bit hard to see if we can bring up the house lights. That would be useful. Let's start over there.
Hi, thank you, Burt Wells. Fascinating discussion and presentation. Thank you. Advanced research projects, terrific. This all sounds like building on a kind of advanced economy and technological infrastructure that we have in the United States and the West. Is there room, and could you tell us about projects that would be meaningful to the developing world, where lack of potable water, lack of electricity, sanitation, health, there's so many very basic problems that perhaps advanced technologies can address effectively and economically today?
I think that is a question that has caught the imagination of many people in engineering and across universities. It's not a mission focus at DARPA. One of Steve mentioned places that are trying the projects model and experimenting with that. And I know there's some interesting experimentation at USAID as an example. So I think there are many others that are much closer to that, and I think I think the students who are coming into engineering programs today, many of them are really focused on the question you posed as a place where they can make a personal contribution. So I'm not the expert, but I think that is an important area.
Great. Let's go on this side.
Hi, Howard Morgan. Thanks for your service at ARPA. Thanks to ARPA for funding my early career as in the early days of the internet.
That's great.
I had heard that ARPA is doing work in Mach 5 and Mach 20 airplanes. What's happening with getting our forces to where they need to be?
Yeah, so the work that we're doing on hypersonics today is, that's a field that has been researched for a very, very long time, and there have been dreams about supersonic and hypersonic transport, but of course for the military, the number one immediate application is going to be weapons. And a lot of our work in hypersonics at DARPA today is trying to do now the systems level weapons prototyping, as opposed to just more the component level, the propulsion, the controls, the materials. The reason that matters from a military point of view is, again, back to how fast things are changing in our world. A lot of our capabilities are phenomenal for precision strike against a fixed target. But we know, for example, from many years of hunting for Osama bin Laden, that one of the great problems is we sometimes have a very short window. Sometimes it's 20 minutes or a half hour when we know what we need to hit. We know precisely where it is. And when you're coming from great distances, the speeds at which our weapons travel simply isn't adequate to close in that short time frame. So I think that will be, from a military utility point of view, that I think will be the first place that you'll see hypersonics.
Another dimension of hypersonics is we see some of our adversaries moving out pretty sharply
absolutely.
and effectively in that dimension.
Yeah. It actually fundamentally changes the pace of the battle when that starts happening. So that's going to be another conundrum.
We'll go back on that side.
Thank you very much, Steve Shapiro. I wonder if I could ask a mundane question about the agency and how it actually works. If you could tell us, perhaps, dive down into how your priorities are determined, and then what you do with them. I mean, I know a little bit about the agency. I suspect that from your presentation, we don't actually know that, in fact, there's a selection process. You go out and you cajole, you find there's application, and you're hand-holding and all of that stuff. So I think it's very interesting how that works, and I think the audience would be grateful to hear it.
Sure. So first priorities, a lot of the magic of DARPA is because it's bottoms up, and these 100 program managers are the people. They are on the line to define the programs, to lay them out sensibly, earn our support, but then just go execute like mad. And so it's critical. I do think, we every couple of years we put together our strategy. We want to build a frame for them to think about where they're going to do their bottoms-up work, but not too much. We have to be very careful not to over-specify, because I need those program managers. So Steve's actually touched on the two key strategic frame issues for DARPA today. One is about the breadth and complexity of national security challenges, much of which we've been talking about here, and the other is the fast pace of global technology. And so we have, that's the kind of thing we talk about at my level. But then the job of the program manager is to come in the door, talk to everyone on the planet that will sit still and talk to them. They go talk to military operators. They go talk to people who are thinking strategically about national security. They go talk to the smartest people they can find in whatever technology area they're working in. And from all of that, they put together a program that is typically 3 to 5 years in duration. It always has a crystal clear objective, and that objective is something that is dazzlingly hard. If you could do it, it would really change the world. It would show people something exciting and change the future. It's crazy, but it's not quite impossible, and that's what their job is, to craft that. Then when we agree to allocate resources, and that might be $20 million over 3 or 5 years, it could be as much as $400 million, depending on what they're trying to do. Once they have the green light to go ahead, they'll publish an announcement, and they'll publicize to the world what they're trying to do. The same technical community from which they got their ideas will then faint and say, "Are you kidding? That's impossible." And then they go to work and they start figuring out how to do it. And through a proposal process, we select the individual performers. And then the program manager's job is to manage that, but also to start gently knitting this into a community. And actually, whatever happens with the technology, some of the longest lasting impacts are those communities that we build in our programs. The final job of the program manager is whatever technically comes out of that program, their job is to get it across the finish line and move it to the next stage. It might be that they came up with some basic research insights that say this field actually could lead to some kind of real technology, and the next step is a program at the National Science Foundation, another program at DARPA. It could be research in a DOE lab. It could be more research. Sometimes we do a prototype military systems demonstration, and the next step is getting the Navy, for example, to test and experiment with our new unmanned ship that can leave the pier and navigate around the seas for months without a single sailor on board, and ultimately to get the Navy hopefully to buy that and start changing the architecture of maritime warfare.
So, Arati, I'll take the privilege of asking, maybe not the last question, but the penultimate question.
Okay.
To drill in a particular area of technology, I think it was last week the Chinese announced the launch of a demonstration satellite that would demonstrate, maybe be the test bed for quantum encryption and quantum communication. So do we have a qubit gap, and if so, what are we going to do about it?
I think there's a lot of, first of all, there's very exciting research in quantum communications and quantum computing, and I think some very interesting things are going to come out of that. I do think we're having a little bit of a confused conversation about quantum computing. I hear frequently from people I think who should know better about how it's going to be what gets us past Moore's law, and it's actually not. These are going to be ways of thinking and doing computing that solve very specific, sometimes incredibly valuable problems like decrypting very complex code, but they're not general purpose computing at all. And so I think I'm exhilarated by the research possibilities, and of course there is a foot race underway to try to see if we can build some real capabilities, and who's going to build them first.
Good. Anybody else? Yeah.
Warren Goat is my name. Looking towards the future, what do you see as some of DARPA's key challenges, whether they are in coming up with new ideas, finding the right program managers to execute these ideas, or maybe it's something mundane as funding?
Yeah, our funding did decline quite significantly between 2009 and 2013. Our funding dropped 20% in real terms. Sequestration, pressures on the defense budget. It's stabilized since then, and I think for our mission, I think we're getting very, very solid support. I'm very pleased about that. The autonomy matters as much as the funding, actually, so I keep an eye on both of those. I think our biggest challenge, the perennial challenge, is finding great people and giving them the environment to do this work. I think that's working, but it will always be hard work. We'll always be focused on that. Our job is to take our blinders off and to help the Defense Department take its blinders off. And I am always amazed at how actively we have to work at that all the time. Part of the reason I came to this meeting is I tell all my people that they need to take a trip a year that is not right in the middle of where they're working, because they need to hear other perspectives and just think about the world in a different way. And I push myself to do that as well. And just by virtue of coming into the office and doing the same thing every day, it's inevitable that the blinders start creeping back. So continuing to just blow our view open and try to be unconstrained by anything more than the facts of physics, right? That I think is our perennial challenge.
Wonderful. I think we have to wrap up at this point. I think you can see that many of us who know the national security scene think that this is the best spent 0.5% of the Pentagon budget.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. That was really fun to do that with you.